Man, I really don't get to play enough Modern, and I kind of dislike that because, well, it is probably my favorite format to play for Magic of all time. And not just because I adore hardened scales, and it's not like I'm trying to live out that fantasy by building things like Liberty Prime and Sultai hardened scales in Commander. No, absolutely not. I adore Modern because I grew up as a Yu-Gi-Oh player primarily, and if you've ever played Yu-Gi-Oh, the only thing that exists in it is the one-on-one competitive format, and it's an eternal format, and Modern just gives me that very, very high-power mono-e-mono feeling while playing Magic the Gathering. And I also enjoy Pioneer a lot, but this video is not going to be about Pioneer because, well, it's Monday, and we just got our ban announcement, so I kind of want to talk about how I felt about Modern. And bear in mind, this is from the position of somebody who loves playing Modern and loves going to tournaments to play Modern, but I have not been able to spend a lot of time doing like high-level competitive events with Modern. It just hasn't been a thing that's been on the table. And in my local area, Modern tournaments only exist in two places, one of which is about an hour and a half away from me, and the other of which is like 45 minutes away from me unless traffic is there because the city is dense. So, unfortunately, this is coming from the jaded perspective of somebody who pines to play more Modern than he gets to on the daily. But the Modern announcement happened, and Violent Outburst is gone. Now, what does this mean, and why was this card taken out of Modern? Well, there's a deck that's existed in Modern, or two decks that existed in Modern for a very long time and have been causing a lot of waves in the format. And the best deck in Modern, quote, quote, has been fluctuating for a while. It was Merc region for a little bit. It's been a lot of decks. Right now, it's sitting at the Leyline of the Guild Pact / Crashing Footfalls build, but let's be honest, Crashing Footfalls isn't a deck. It's actually 12 cards masquerading as a shell, and you just kind of throw those 12 cards into any pile, and suddenly it's a Footfalls deck. You put Violent Outburst, Shardless Agent, and Crashing Footfalls in a deck, and suddenly it's a Footfalls deck. That's all it is. But why was this taken out? Well, it's an instant cast Cascade card, and the line of play for the Footfalls deck was always turn 1, play land, turn 2, play land, and maybe suspend a Rhinos somewhere in there, but they couldn't cast any spells because the deck would not be made up of any spells that had a full cost of, 1 or 2, because the deck wanted to always be able to hit Crashing Footfalls once it casted Violent Outburst. And then they would get to turn 3, play a land, and then pass to you. And you would look at them kind of like, do I just get a free win here? And, it's not the case. You're not getting a free win. At the end of your turn, they would cast a Violent Outburst, and when you tried to interact with it, they would hit you with a Force of Negation. And this was the line of play that would always happen that made Footfall such a linear deck. Now, before the with Violent Outburst going away, I'm going to go ahead and make a prediction before I continue. It's just going to get replaced with Bloodbraid Elf. Like, Bloodbraid Elf gives the Footfalls deck everything that it wants, but it does not have the toxic line of play, which is hold up Force of Negation for the Violent Outburst. Now, to give a bit of history of how I feel about this card and why I actually don't think this card should have been the one that was banned. I'm gonna be honest. I actually think it should have been Force of Negation. As a player who has played 4 major decks in Modern, not counting when, like, friends have handed me their decks to play, and I've gotten a chance to play with those, but the decks that I invested money in and built were a Selesnya Bogles deck, which did not have a play pattern that dealt with Footfalls, a Hardened Scales deck, which has plenty of play patterns that deal with Footfalls, an Affinity deck, which beats the Footfalls deck before the Footfall ever gets to trigger, typically, and then a Is It Bogles deck, which was my pride and joy, which basically involved using the Slippery Bogle as a mutate target so that Lord Drakis could touch it and recycle Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt, and Counterspell. And you just kind of use those over and over and over until the game was complete by just never letting your opponent resolve spells. And it was really good when the format was comprised mostly of, like, Prowess decks and Ragavan decks, because it's just very funny to look at a Ragavan and go, that's a cool dash trigger. It's never happening ever again. So that's where I'm at, where only 2 of the decks that I've played and the 2 that I've preferred the most had play patterns that could handle Footfalls. But if I'm being honest, this is going to sound hypocritical as a affinity player, I actually don't like free spells in Magic the Gathering. I really don't like free cycle spells. And there's a couple reasons for that. I think that cards in the game are generally balanced for the purpose of playing them on a curve. And when a ton of spells are free, that balance is kind of thrown out the window. And I understand in a high-power competitive format, that's something that can't really be circumvented, or it's something that you kind of have to deal with, right? Is that balance is there, but the aim of the game is to break that balance. But exceedingly more and more, that balance has not existed at all, whether it be Force of Negation being the free cast on your opponent's turn, whether it be the last ban list that knocked out Fury, which was the free cast way of making it so that Wizards of the Coast couldn't make Grizzly Bears in Modern anymore. Or it's even things like Affinity. Affinity had a history of breaking the format as well, and that not Modern specifically, though Chrome Mox did get banned, so maybe an argument could be made that Affinity had a little too much power while Chrome Mox was around. But my general idea is that I don't hate cards like Violent Outburst because I feel like there are plenty of ways to deal with it. There's plenty of ways to handle it via counterspell. There's plenty of ways to handle it by, removing the Rhinos from play. But my biggest problem with Violent Outburst has always been the fact that when you cast the Violent Outburst and the Crashing Footfalls is going to be on the stack, the play pattern is always hold up a counterspell or a reaction spell and use it on the Rhinos, and the Force of Negation would always be free. And exiling a blue card from your hand is not actually that big a cost at all, because with the Rhinos, you're getting 2 4/4 Rhinos with Trample, which is better than most creatures in Modern up until the Ley Line happened. We need to talk about the Ley Line. So, in terms of mana investment, 3 mana for an 8/8 with Trample functionally is really good. We've seen this exact type of thing before with another card that used to dominate the format, Merc Tide Regent, which is this lovely dude here. You end up spending 2 mana for him, and he ends up being an 8/8 with flying. The only difference between him and the Rhinos is a single removal spell can deal with him, but with the Rhinos, you need 2 removal spells, or one of those really wonky ones that makes your opponent sack multiple creatures that, let's be honest, you're not running because it's Modern, and you don't have time for janky edict effects. Not really. But I never minded, say, the Murktide deck. I know a lot of people were not happy about the play patterns of playing Darcy, to drop a Bauble on the board, to use free spells, which, again, free spells, once again, use free spells to get to the point where the Murktide would come out on, turn 2 or 3 with this massive body that felt overwhelming to deal with. There's enough removal available in Modern, and he doesn't have any protection on himself. Outside of, again, this card. Everything I said about Murktide makes him a perfectly reasonable card to deal with in a format that is as big, wonky, and twisted as Modern until you get back to the Force of Negation. All the play patterns that deal with the Violent Outburst get stopped by the Force of Negation. All the play patterns that deal with the Murktide Regent stumble when it comes to, again, the Force of Negation. Because the Force of Negation, if you try to get rid of the Murktide on your turn, if that's the opportune thing for you to do, the Force just stops you. If you go onto the opponent's turn, now they've got access to their Force of Negation and their counterspell, and probably like a Spell Pierce if it's a game 2. They now can protect the card, but a lot of that was because you had to wait for your opponent's untap phase, which is not the investment the blue player is supposed to make in Magic the Gathering is, do I play my big thing, or do I hold up mana for my counterspell? And I've never liked that Force of Negation and cards like it prevent players from having to make that choice. It makes all the choices linear. Now, the Murktide can just come down and know he's safe. He's guaranteed safe, because the opponent is not going to be able to turn 3 kill the Murktide because you couldn't hold up mana for a counterspell. You don't need the mana. You got a Force of Negation. You'll even exile an extra counterspell to protect the Murktide, because the likelihood that the Murktide runs away with the game without you having to spend any mana anymore is high. My issue is, and always will be, that Force of Negation snipes things during the window of opportunity that players typically have to interact with cards, and that's just not something that I'm a huge fan of. I like when cards have this play pattern that is, while dynamic, understandable, and there is a known weakness to a card, and again, the known weakness to something like the Crashing Footfalls, outside of dropping, a Void Mirror or something on your opponent that says they don't get cards that cost nothing, like Force of Negation. Outside of cards like the Void Mirror, the play pattern for Footfalls is to hold up mana in decks that have blue, of which there are many in Modern. I played quite a few of them. My Affinity deck could side into a more mid-rangey control deck. My Hardened Scales deck can side into that as well. My Bogle's deck, the Izzet one, was built as a control package to begin with, so all I had to do was side in Spell Pierces. Like, all of these decks have some pattern that allows them access to the blue, because Scales has Glimmer Void and Spire of Industry that give them access to blue mana for various things. So when you look at things like Force of Negation, it's very easy to answer it if it was not a free card. If it was a card that had to be played on curve. And that just creates a huge problem for me. Because, again, when a card does not have to be played on curve, then the card no longer has to be balanced around that. And that brings me to the next issue. Remember when Scam was a deck? Because it's and we're not just all talking about Rhinos today. We could talk about Rhinos all day, but we do need to talk about other decks that have been important in the Modern format. And the last major deck that was important before ban was Rakdos Scam around Fury and Grief. And these are the Evoke Elementals. You exile any card from your hand to play them for free. These were the free cards of Modern Horizons 2, whereas the Force of Vigor, Force of Negation, those were the free cards of Modern Horizons 1. And we're going to get more free cards in Modern Horizons 3, but they don't look as busted, thank God. But these are the free cards of this one. And the play pattern with these for Scam was really, really simple. You would have a card like Grief, which comes down and is a Thoughtseize, and you played it for free. So you have a Thoughtseize on turn 1, and then the Grief gets hit with a Feign Death, and then the Grief comes back down and automatically Thoughtseizes you again, and is also a 3/2 menace. So now you've got to deal with a 3/2 menace creature, which is, while normally easy to deal with in Modern because of its stats, if you're playing red, if you're playing a deck that leans further into black, your removal's probably like Fatal Push. If you have a fetch land, cool, you can kill the Grief. Unless they, griefed the Fatal Push out of your hand because it's Grief, and they had that option. They had it twice, because that's what Grief does. So this deck relied on using Grief and Fury to snipe cards out of the hand, kill cards on the board, and again, the deck functioned because of free cards. Cards that were free. Now, there is not a problem in my mind with cheating cards out. Cheating a card out means using something that circumvents the cost, whereas this is a free card is a card that just says, I don't have a cost, or I have an alternate cost that is functionally not a cost. Grief, Solitude, Subtlety, these are the backbone of those types of decks. But if I were to talk about cards I don't hate as much, I know that Atraxa Grand Unifier has been making splashes in Modern and also in Pioneer. It's part of a Transmog deck in Pioneer. My girlfriend runs it. But Atraxa is also part of a pretty strong deck in Modern at the moment using Goryo's Vengeance, because tossing an Atraxa out of your hand for any variety of things, Underworld Cookbook, just make an Asmarana, Camardica Dice to the Cool to Card pile. It's okay. But tossing Atraxa from your hand and then Goryo's Vengeancing it out, I don't think that's as toxic of a play pattern, because that requires you to have multiple named cards that all do the exact thing you need. You need the thing that pitches the card away, you need the card in your graveyard not interacted with by like a Stone of Eric or something, and then you need the Goryo's Vengeance in your hand to go off. You must have multiple named cards to get this effect, whereas in the event of using Grief and Solitude plus Ephemerate or Feign Death or anything like that, the way to get these cards out for free, even just getting their effects, irrespective of if you keep them on the board with things like Feign Death or Ephemerate, Irrespective of that, they're still 100% free no matter what card is in your hand, because your deck probably has cards of the appropriate color if you built your deck correctly. Force of Negation, same idea. As long as you have cards of the appropriate color, the card doesn't really care so much about that. And again, there's another very, very strong deck in Modern that is built on cheating cards out, but I still feel like it's fairer than decks that use things like Force of Negation to me, because there are modes of interaction with it, whereas Force of Negation is, by design, a way to look at modes of interaction and laugh in their face. And these are, of course, the Living End decks. These decks will use the Griefs, the Solitudes, the Subtleties. They use these creatures and let them hit the graveyard. They're not super worried about these guys hitting the graveyard like they normally would, because all these guys are, as far as the deck is concerned, are high mana cost cards so that Shardless Agent can grab the Living End from the deck and cast it after they've gone through a very particular play pattern. That play pattern being taking Generous Ent, Oliphant, and Troll of Khazad-dûm, tossing them to the graveyard to thin the deck out little by little, and then you've got this 6/5, this 6/4, this 5/7, that all come out for free because of Living End. But again, there is a pattern of play with even a deck like this that is built on spending 1 mana on everything that is interactable, with the exception of these free cards that get to do a Path to Exile effect, a Thoughtseize effect, and a pseudo counterspell effect, which can even be a little better than a counterspell in some ways, because it doesn't put the card in the graveyard. So if you're doing a mirror match against another, say, Living End deck, by putting the card in a place other than the graveyard, you're not giving them fuel when you are actively working towards an endgame. It's the free cards that I don't like. And again, I know this sounds hypocritical. I play Affinity. Look, I also may have taken my Affinity deck apart a little bit recently because I went to a tournament, played it, used Neoform on a Thought Monitor, got out Craterhoof Behemoth with just a few creatures on the board and went, oh, right, that's why I don't like Craterhoof Behemoth. I much preferred using Archon of Cruelty with that because it had a more interesting pattern of play to me. And maybe that's my problem. Maybe Commander has soiled me on wanting to see interesting patterns of play, even in formats where I'm not here to do lots of intricate patterns of play. Maybe that's the reason why I love Scales so much, right? Like, the Hardened Scales deck, for those who don't know, is a deck that relies on 0, 1, and 2 cost cards all throughout the entire deck, and each card either has 1/1 counters on it, abuses 1/1 counters, or increases the amount of 1/1 counters you get. So, like, Hardened Scales, when you get a 1/1 counter, add another one. The Ozolith, if a card dies with 1/1 counters, throw those 1/1 counters on the Ozolith. But I lied, it doesn't say die, it says when the card leaves the battlefield. Cards with Modular say die. Cards with Modular have that effect. So if a modular creature dies with, say 2 1/1 counters, 2 1/1 counters go to another modular creature, and then the Ozolith clones the counters because it's a separate trigger. And then the end game plan is to do a few things. Punch them in the face with a Patchwork Automaton for like 20 damage because it has Ward 2, and Wizard staples that on everything because they forgot how to design cards. Or put all the counters on a Walking Ballista to blow somebody up with non-combat damage, or kill a bunch of threats with it and then melee them to death with it. Or throw everything onto an Arcbound Ravager by sacking everything to it to punch somebody for lots of damage. Or have the Ravager throw all of its counters onto the Walking Ballista, cloning everything with the Ozolith so that you get free counters. Or throwing everything onto the Zabaz and then tapping a white mana. Please run white mana in your Hardened Scales decks. It's not a mono green deck. Please stop pretending it is. But dropping all of the counters onto Zabaz, and then remembering that he has a line of text that gives him flying, and turning him sideways at somebody. You have no idea how many times I've been in a tournament, and I have won a match solely because somebody did not read Zabaz, and just went, oh, it's the funny wasp that makes more 1/1 counters happen when modular triggers happen. That's all he is. Like, no, that's not all he is. He's got another trigger, and the other trigger is stupid. It's not just the modular thing you have to worry about. I misspoke when I said trigger. His thing is that he works as a pseudo Arcbound Ravager, blowing up your own things, and he can give himself flying. He is his own win condition, and if you drop 2 Zabazas on the board, then they see each other, Legendary Rule kills one, and then of course he increases the counters from the other. Zabaz has insane synergy with himself. He's amazing. And of course, in later sets, we have gotten the wonderful Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which is a super fun way to just go, you know, I liked everything I was doing, and then you removed it from the game, but that's fine. My Patchwork Automaton has the activated abilities of my Walking Ballista now, so every time I cast an artifact spell, I get 1 counter closer to killing you to death. I turn the Patchwork Automaton sideways. If you don't block, you die. If he's got 10-10, I am just hitting you for 10 and then zeroing him out, making your life total 0. I'm sorry that I gushed about Scales as much as I did, but I adore this deck. And it is the most expensive Modern deck I have ever played, and it is some of the most fun I've had in a card game ever. But of course, Scales is not going to be affected too much by the Violent Outburst thing, because Scales already had patterns of play that didn't really care too much about the Force of Negation, outside of, like, them using Force to stop Oceliths from coming down. Yeah, I'm going to be salty about that one. But that's fine. I liked looking at a blue player and going, oh, you have mana up, I have to worry about you, versus not having mana up, oh, I still have to worry about you. But there are some decks that are going to get stronger now because of this banning. Violent Outburst being gone means that Crashing Footfalls is now a sorcery speed deck for the most part, and because of that, other sorcery speed decks like Primeval Titan that rely on using the Amulet of Vigor to let the bounce lands do their thing to an obscene degree are going to be that much stronger because their matchup against Footfalls is now a lot more even. It's another sorcery speed deck. And of course, we can't talk about sorcery speed decks without talking about the granddaddy of sorcery speed decks, the Tron decks, which already had a huge boost recently thanks to the One Ring. You have no idea what it's like dating somebody who plays Tron and also loves Phyrexian Metalmorph and Sculpting Steel and adores Karn the Great Creator. Like, that person that I am dating, who is wonderful and I love her to death, the amount of times that games have just been, here is the Karn, he searches the One Ring is out. Oh, I'm going to use Karn to pull out a copy of Sculpting Steel. It's a One Ring. I'm going to use Karn to pull out more artifacts. Phyrexian Metalmorph is in the deck. It's a copy of One Ring. We're going to copy One Ring over and over again because all of these cards actually still give you protection from everything with One Ring. It may be a little obnoxious to deal with Tron decks, but they did get a lot more power recently because of the One Ring coming out, and of course they have even more power now because one of the stronger instant speed decks is now a sorcery speed deck primarily, at least its main play pattern is. But of course, there is another card that I wish had been yanked away during this whole banning, and it's not, and I kind of understand why it isn't, but at the same time, maybe I just really want Wizards to recognize when they've printed a mistake. Leyline of the Guild Pack. I am going to say, in terms of free cards, I don't like the Leylines, but at the very least, they have a requirement where you must mulligan down to them. But you know who doesn't mind mulliganing down to Leyline of the Guild Pack? Any deck running Scion of Draco. They'll mulligan down to 3 or 4 cards just to go, here's the Leyline, here's my land, go. Land Scion of Draco. Do you have a response? Nope, I guess you lose. And the pattern to deal with this feels cheesy. Like, the way to deal with Scion of Draco is edict effects. That's what you have to do, is you have to have an edict effect in your deck to deal with the Scion of Draco. Like, of course, you could use a Nature's Claim, knock out the Leyline of the Guild Pack, and then the Scion of Draco is a bit easier to handle. But because decks like the Shardless Agent decks were already using, like, they've got Violent Outburst, Bloodbraid Elf, Shardless Agent. They don't have Violent Outburst anymore, but all of their cards were already these either zero-cost cards that are coming out with their effect, or these high-cost cards that have ways to cheat them out. Then you look at decks like the Leyline deck, which uses a Leyline, which of course dodges both Bloodbraid Elf and Shardless Agent, and then a Scion of Draco, which of course dodges both of them by being a 2-mana card that costs 12, in theory. The Force of Negation wouldn't have changed, the play patterns of Zoo. Domain Zoo, having access to Hexproof Scion of Draco, gave it a lot more power recently. And I'm interested to see how things are going to pan out with this deck and one other. Because I have a friend who's a very, very good Zoo player and has been playing the deck for about 2 or 3 years now and has done very, very well with it, with very minimal changes. He's a very hey, my thing is built, I bought once, I cried once, and now I'm going to master the deck in every way, shape, and form. So I've dealt with the Scion of Draco in his deck for years, and just having this extra tool here, and it's a free spell, it is an interesting card, and I don't hate its design. I just hate that it's a ley line, and I'm very tired of free spells in Magic the Gathering, especially when those free spells are in Modern. And again, I know I'm playing Affinity, so I really am a hypocrite here. Tell me in the comments how much of a hypocrite I am for this. But the other deck that's going to get a huge boost because Violent Outburst is banned is, of course, Yogg Daddy. Yawgmoth was a deck that already had a play pattern that was very, very quick, so long as they could assemble the combo, and the combo is fairly linear. Yawgmoth comes out with the Undying stuff. Woohoo! As long as they could get that combo out, they could deal with the Rhinos already, and then infinite you down to death very, very easily, because they use cards like Court of Calling to get all the pieces they need for their combo out. Yawgmoth is a super strong deck, and when I was playing Bogles exclusively, I struggled a lot to deal with Yawgmoth combo because it turns out having a deck that has an easily usable counterspell over and over again, it only works when you have the one brain cell required to counter the correct cards. Otherwise, you stare at Yawgmoth and go, why are you out of Lightning Bolt range? Why do you have a toughness of 4? But Yawgmoth also has another card in it that is used in more than just his deck, but it's a card that a lot of people have had feelings about, and that's the Orcus Brewmasters. And I'm gonna be 100% honest, I actually don't feel like Bowmasters is the worst thing in Modern. Not really. It was strong in Scam, 110%, and then Fury went away, and Scam became less of an issue. Now Orzhov's Scam is the closest thing to the Scam deck you can run, where instead of Fury, they're using Solitude, and they've got access to the Feign Death and the Ephemerate, and it's still a solid deck, don't get me wrong, but Orcish Bowmasters is just kind of like a piece in that deck. The best piece at what it does in that deck, to be sure, especially when you've got, decks like Yawgmoth that go, I don't have my combo assembled yet. You made 2 bodies on the board. That is convenient. Decks like Yawgmoth, these combo-y decks, are going to get a huge boost from Violent Outburst being gone, because now, again, I have to keep saying it, when you take the instant speed deck and you dumb it down to a sorcery speed deck, the deck loses a lot of power. Footfalls is still going to be strong. They're still going to have their 12-card package. It's just going to be Bloodbraid Elf, Shardless Agent, and Rhinos. But, again, it was losing that instant speed access, which by nature also meant they lost the Force of Negation synergies that they had before. And if that's all you need to lower the power of Rhinos, I can't keep saying it over and over again. Please, Wizards. I would rather the Force of Negation go away, because it is a free spell. Don't... Banning the common from Shards block that doesn't affect the entry point for the deck at all, versus banning the $40 counterspell they run 4 of, which is a mainstay in multiple decks, mind you, like Murktide and the current Goryo's deck, and also a thing that gets ran in Subtlety Scam. This card is a higher price point, which means there is a harder entry point for people to get into Modern. You lower the entry point for the Rhinos deck for people by getting rid of this requirement in the deck, and the Rhino deck gets to still be an instant speed deck, with Violent Outburst being an option it has on turn 3, while also, again, giving players the ability to lower the power of that Rhinos deck so that if you really are truly worried about it, then you're good. I think that Violent Outburst was not the thing to hit, personally. I really think it was the Force Negation, because my experience with it has always been that the Force Negation is the problem card. But there is another elephant in the room that we got to talk about, and I know the video is getting long. I am sorry about that. I like Modern a lot, so when I'm starting to talk about Modern, I tend to hyperfixate on it just a little bit. But there is one other card that we have to talk about, and it's an elephant in the room, and you and I both know it's going to be in Modern very soon. It's this one. So Modern Horizons 3 is coming out, and there's a lot of things that are going to happen. And this is the other side of the coin, where maybe I actually think Wizards might have a point in not banning everything that I want them to get rid of, like the Force Negation. While I do still think that the play patterns of Force Negation are not great, and I want it to be gone, Modern Horizons 3 is coming out. And because Modern Horizons 3 is coming out, there's going to be a whole lot of cards that completely change the way that the format is played. Again, the Footfalls deck existed in its strongest form due to Shardless Agent coming out. The Domain deck exists in its strongest form thanks to the addition of Scion of Draco. I mean, I don't think the deck even really existed in a functional way before Scion of Draco. It was just a Zoo deck. And now it's Zoo focusing more on the domain synergies because of Scion of Draco. And even Affinity didn't exist in its strongest form until Thought Monitor came out. I mean, yes, I know ATOG was a thing. Let me know in the comment section about how much you loved ATOG before it got banned. And then, of course, for Modern Horizons 2, my favorite deck, Scales, also didn't exist in its strongest form until Zabaz came in and gave us all kinds of free stuff. Most of the decks that currently exist in the format outside of that did not exist at all, strongest form or not. The scam decks did not exist without the elementals to scam out. Murktide was not a deck until, Murktide himself was printed. The decks that use Ragavan, all of them, the Prowess decks, did not have their greatest power until the Monkey was brought in. So we know from experience that Modern Horizons 3 is going to give the rotation of the format. Tons of new stuff is going to come in. Lots of decks are going to become power crept out. It always happens in a giant chunk when this set comes into the rotation, because Modern does have a rotation now. Yes, I understand. It doesn't technically have one, but it is basically a rotation. It's rotation in the same way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Had a rotation. New cards power creep in, old cards end up getting creeped out. And that is a rotation, as far as I'm concerned. But Emrakul the World Anew, basically having protection from anything that's cast this turn, which is just terrible wording. Terrible wording. You could have just said protection from spells. You could have said protection from spells. But gaining control of all creatures your opponent controls is a huge tempo swing, and the fact that it has a madness cost that can be paid on turn 3 or 4 by Tron is insanely good. I've seen a lot of creators saying this particular opinion, and I want to echo it. Pleasant Kenobi said this before I did, though, so this is not a me thing. This is entirely a him thing. But Underworld Cookbook being a card, for those who don't know, it drops onto the board, and then it lets you discard any card in your hand to create a food. So that deck is just going to discard Emrakul, and then you're going to pay Tron mana for Emrakul, and then she's going to steal all of your opponent's creatures, and then you're basically going to win the game. It may not have haste, but unless somebody can kill Emrakul not with a spell, then you're basically... You win. Decks like Tron that already have this huge power spike because of the One Ring gave them lots of power because it meant that they could stabilize on turn 4. And being able to stabilize on turn 4 gives Tron the breathing room it needs to deal with things like Boros Burn. Emrakul lets Tron go from stabilizing on turn 4 to just going, all your shit mine. And of course, because we run greedy mana bases, this is the funny thing as well. Because we run greedy mana bases in Modern, people tend to end up at about 12 or 13 life from using shock and fetch lands alone. This, of course, means that even if Emrakul doesn't have access to any creatures, merely taking all of your opponent's blockers away and just letting Emrakul turn sideways at somebody, that is a huge win condition already. I think this card is going to make a lot of waves, and Tron Food is going to become a deck. And I echo Pleasant Kenobi in saying that Tron Food is going to end up being a deck, because Emrakul World Anew is that busted. One of the balancing factors of Eldrazi classically has been that outside of cheating them in with cards like Nira, Emrakul and Ulamog and Kozilek have really, really obnoxiously big mana costs that must be figured out from you. They are a problem to solve. Emrakul World Anew, because of the existence of Tron decks, doesn't have a problem to solve anymore. It's just play Underworld Cookbook, have 3 Tron lands, profit. That's the play pattern now. So I don't know how much the card's going to cost. I'm going to go ahead and venture that Emrakul World Anew is going to be about a $60 or $70 card, because that is an Emrakul trend, and we'll see how it ends up going. But this video's gone on long enough. I just wanted to talk about the ban list, and now we're here. Now we're here. Thank you for listening to my rambling rant about Modern, and hopefully your deck did not get completely squashed by our ban card. You know, I sometimes feel like Wizards should take out more cards at once instead of just, like one card at a time. I remember playing Luris. Do you remember playing Luris? Anywho, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already. And as always, everybody, thank you for watching, and insert in the video tagline here.
Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Mabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.